New York City has many streets named after historical people. Right here in the Bronx, Colin Powell Way, Roscoe C. Brown Plaza, and Fannie Lou Hamer Street. One of the most recent additions, Claudette Colvin Way, speaks to a defining moment in the civil rights struggle. In March of 1955, Claudette Colvin was riding the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She sat in the front, at a time when segregation laws only allowed black people to sit in the back. She refused to give up her seat for white people.
Yeah, the people on the bus saying that that I had to get up, talking amongst themselves and calling me and using the N-word and everything.
Colvin had been learning about black leaders and barrier breakers like Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, and Jackie Robinson. This was part of what was then called Negro History Week, which eventually became Black History Month. But two other historical figures were on her mind.
So John Truthhammer pushed me down on one shoulder, and Harriet Tubman was pushing me down on another. And I said that history had me glued to the seat, and I couldn't move. I had a teenager mind. At the time, I didn't have to think about the family and the welfare and the consequences of my action. I had a teenager mind. I was only responding to that bus audience.
Colvin was taken off the bus and manhandled, as she said. She was arrested, charged with disorderly conduct, assault and battery, and violating the segregation laws.
And when they put the handcuffs on me through the window, I realized that I was in trouble.
This brief encounter paved the way for protests in Montgomery over the next year and helped ignite the country's larger civil rights movement.
Her actions really were the impetus for the bus boycotts.
Tracy Baptiste is the author of a graphic historical novel that covers the period between Claudette's action and then 9 months later, when Rosa Parks also refused to give up her seat.
It becomes super, super important to have stories like Claudette's, for example, be part of the historical record for really young kids. Because I think young kids understand that you don't have to be the biggest name in the room. You don't have to do the biggest things. You can do your little part and have it be meaningful.
What happened 9 months after Colvin's arrest was, in fact, a pretty big thing. In June of 1956, Claudette testified in the Browner v. Gale case in federal court in Montgomery. This case, brought by lawyer Fred Gray on behalf of Claudette and 3 other plaintiffs, sought to overturn the bus segregation law.
Her lawyer, Fred Gray, specifically had her go last because he knew how good a speaker she was. But it really was her testimony that got the court to agree that the law was unjust and to throw it out.
Fred Gray and the 4 plaintiffs, Colvin, Aurelia S. Browder, Susie McDonald, and Mary Louise Smith, won the case that was later upheld at the Supreme Court.
We was jubilant that day.
She had an incredible impact on the movement in Montgomery as part of a stream of people, Montgomery residents, who were challenging segregation in different ways.
Christopher Brian Burrell is an associate professor at Hostos Community College.
Because as a young black person in the Deep South in the 1950s, I mean, she was literally putting her life on the line, the lives of her family members potentially, as well as any chances at potential economic stability and security in that city. So she was risking a lot by being willing to testify and doing so as the mother of a very young child.
Things did indeed get hard for Colvin after her win in court.
In my community, people shunned me. The parents told their children, don't go near Claudette Colvin, because she is trouble. A lot of black people was afraid of white people because you remember the KKK was very active in those days. So they didn't want to lose their job or get into trouble.
She also got pregnant and had a hard time holding on to a job.
After people got to know me, I was labeled as the girl in the bus seat. I became anonymous, but when my identity was revealed, the employer would fire me. So I switched to several jobs, and eventually I had to leave Montgomery.
And that brings us to Parkchester. Colvin eventually moved to the Bronx in the 1950s. She lived in different areas before finally settling at Metropolitan Oval right here in Parkchester. She worked as a nurse's assistant at Mary Manning Washington Nursing Home in Manhattan and joined SEIU 1199, the nurses union.
That's what stabilized me and gave me a decent salary, and I had benefits, through the union. And that's what kept me stabilized.
Colvin lived a full life in New York and then moved back to Montgomery to be close to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her arrest record was recently expunged, and a granite marker rests next to a statue of Rosa Parks in her home city.
Her place for me is essential, but it is as essential as the people who were working the phones to call to make sure that people had a ride to work when they weren't taking the buses, or the people who were from all over the country who were sending in shoes. There were millions of people who were doing little things that contributed.
I describe myself as a teenage rebel. And I defied the unfair laws that was sanctioned under states' rights.
And a message for future generations?
Don't have this defeatist attitude. Complete what we left undone.
For Diverse City, I'm Craig Thompson.